I'm thrilled to be here with representatives of 3 cities that are among the most advanced in terms of their journey in EV charging. And I'm Elaine Buckberg. I'm from Harvard's Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability, and I run our program on driving towards seamless EV charging. And we've had 2 top priorities, because the places where charging is most important for EV adoption. One is highways, because everyone wants to be able to do a road trip with their car, no matter how many cars in their household and how few road trips they actually do. And the other is cities, because in cities, more people rely on public charging. They're more likely to park on the street, be a renter, live in a multifamily unit. Public charging just becomes much more important. And for the past year, we've been working with 8 cities that are relatively advanced on their journeys to distill their insights to help cities that are just starting their journeys or not as far along figure out how to develop EV charging to enable adoption. And so I'm thrilled to be joined by Austin's own Cameron Freburg, who's the manager for electric vehicles and emerging technologies at Austin Energy. And his work at Austin Energy has supported program development and operations around new technologies, including transportation electrification, but also energy storage and more. And then from the world's leading EV market, we have Sara Teige Kalsas, who's e-mobility advisor for the Agency for Urban Environment in the city of Oslo, Norway. And Sara's main tasks have been related to planning processes on both the AC and DC public chargers in Oslo. And she also works on building chargers for taxis, for freight vehicles, and for heavy duty. And to give you a sense of how advanced Norway is, if you're not aware, 42% of all registered vehicles in Oslo are battery electric vehicles. And out of sales, it's 95%. Austin's still pretty advanced. You're at 15% of sales. And Michael Samulon comes to us from the most advanced EV market in the United States. He's Deputy Director over Electrification in the Energy and Sustainability Office of Mayor Karen Bass. He focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution through transportation electrification. He's seen the deployment of over 1,500 electric vehicles in the city fleet, charging infrastructure for employees and the public. And he also works with the Port of LA and LA Metro on freight and transit electrification. LA boasts 26% of new vehicle sales are EVs. So let's get into it. So let's start by just talking, what's the biggest change that you've seen in your city from the presence of EV chargers? And why should cities invest in EV charging? And Sara, you're the pioneer. I want to start with you.
Thank you. Like you said, 95% of all new sold cars in Oslo are now electric. So that shows that the biggest change we've managed to create is that EVs are now becoming the obvious choice for people. When you buy a car, you buy an electric car. I think almost all last year, we basically didn't sell any diesel cars in Oslo anymore, which is an incredible change in just like 10 to 12 years. And that showed that when we make charging and electric vehicles affordable and accessible for people, they will take the sustainable choice as well. So I think that's one of the sort of key goals we managed to create. Because in the beginning, people who bought electric cars were like enthusiasts. They were very engaged in like the climate cause, and it was for that reason they chose electric cars. But now we see that people who might want to take sustainable choices, but it's difficult for them because they have to prioritize like the personal finances or other things, also make the more sustainable choice because they can based on their finances. And we see that it's people of all age groups and all layers of society are choosing the electric cars. So even old people, there was recently a story in the news where a 100-year-old man bought his first electric car. He was a bit nervous about how to charge it, but he managed fine. And we also see the family with small kids are choosing electric cars. So I think that's the biggest change we see, that it's now the natural choice for people to make.
Okay. Michael, what about you? What was the biggest change you saw?
Yeah, I would fully agree. You know, this 10 years ago when we were working on this, we were selling it. You always had to be pushing and explaining whether it was your fleet customer or, you know, it happened to be someone who's not an early adopter of why we need to do this and what's the value of the charger, what's the value of the EV. And that's no longer where we are. The early adoption has happened. Like you mentioned, we're at 25% new vehicle sales in Los Angeles, which is tremendous. And it means that it's much more of a sort of standard. And it's interesting to see that the government is still needed. We're still there. We're still trying to facilitate charging installation, make it easier. You know, you're always looking to improve. But the market has really stepped in, whereas 5-10 years ago, it really did require a lot more intervention on our end to sort of promote whether it was funding, other sort of simplifications of the process to really try and attract people. And now that's not necessary. Now people are coming to us all the time, and and in a way, when they point out problems that we have, that shows that they care and that it matters, and that's sort of different from 5-10 years ago.
And I think both of you have made a great point about the getting to critical levels where you get inherent momentum and where also people just like, okay, I'll just ask for more charging where I need it. Cameron, tell us about Austin and what's been changing as Austin and Austin Energy have installed more chargers.
Yeah, the biggest thing I've seen in change of EV charging is, first of all, quantity. So we're seeing a lot more broad demographic adopting electric vehicles. There used to be, a lot of people were interested like in environmental reasons or things like that. Texas is a very historically oil and gas state, if you haven't noticed that. And but adoption here in Texas is extremely high as well. So when we first started seeing EV charging go out, you might see some companies put them in for like sustainability pieces, for big marquee projects that drew people into their business. Now it's getting a lot more utilitarian. You're seeing fleets like change over to electric. You're seeing a lot of transition, in like the way multifamily housing is built to make sure that's an amenity for people that come and live on those properties now. So just the quantity is growing, the use cases are growing, and now we're seeing kind of the business model emerge for EV charging as well. So it's not 100% government. There's still some, dependencies with government and private industry as well, but you're seeing some investment come in here too. So we've seen a big transition. We have about 60,000 electric vehicles here in Austin. I know we're just at the beginning of that. I actually remember when we got our 100th EV, and I thought, wow, we've really made it. But there's still a long way to go with it. So.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk about how you launched this process though, because putting charging in is, it involves a lot of planning because you just can't put a charger, much less a fast charger, down anywhere in the city. And it involves a lot of coordination often within government. So let's start with how you started planning your program and what was the initial impetus. And I think we'll again go in order of history and let Sara start telling us about how Oslo started its journey.
Yeah, so we actually started putting out curbside chargers in 2007, which in EV years is a really long time ago. And they were small and just a basic plug. So at that time, our motto was basically seeing is believing. So we put them in very centrally located places in the city so people could see that it was an option. And the reason why we started the program was because the current city council had a 10-point plan to reduce climate gas emissions. So it was a part of reducing emissions from the beginning. And in later years, it's become an integral part of Oslo's climate budget. And now we've changed the tactic a little bit, so we don't necessarily put them in the most centrally located, visible places. We try to find more of the areas where people are very dependent on street parking and where they are most dependent on public charging to be able to actually have an EV.
Great. And is visibility an issue? I know Europe has more low-profile chargers that might result in less, shall I say, NIMBYism about it, but did initially you want chargers to be sort of very visible?
I mean, now this point is sort of a 50-50. We always get the question, why do you have to build a charger in my street? I don't want it. But also, oh, it's so good that you build it in my street because I need it. So no matter where we build, it's always someone who hates it and someone who loves it. And that goes for basically every location we build. So I think that's sort of something we just have to live with in a way. But we do see that after certain times and when we make adaptations to like where we place it, which colors we use so that it's not too like visible in terms of like, especially in areas of the city where you might have like older, nicer buildings to like keep the historical presence. So with some adaptations, we make it work. But yeah, it's definitely always someone who likes it and someone who doesn't.
Okay, Cameron, how did Austin and Austin Energy start planning its charging program, and what was the impetus?
Sure, yeah, we came in very late to the game, all the way up to 2011, so not quite 2007 when we started deploying ours. But we've always had very robust goals around sustainability, carbon reduction, things like that here. So that's just a little bit of kind of the policy backing we have in Austin. And so we got some federal funding back in 2010, 2011 to deploy just over 100 EV chargers, which seemed like a crazy amount considering we weren't even at 100 cars yet. But that's okay. It's always good for infrastructure to outpace growth, not the other way around. So we started there, and initially the stories were out like, oh, this happened all across the US. These chargers are there, nobody's using them. And that quickly went away once adoption went up. So we started scaling from there. We're at over 1,500 ports now that we have within the city of Austin, just the ones that we work with and own or operate. Then there's a bunch of private sector investment too. We also branched out and put it in DC fast charging here as well. So we're seeing, with those amount of use cases that are growing, whether it be, like I mentioned earlier, multifamily fleets, other kind of forms of electrification, the infrastructure is continuing to grow with it. But our pathway was basically building off a federal grant, seeing what kind of usage there was, and then kind of incentivizing our commercial customers to kind of join that network and attract EV drivers to like either their businesses, their properties. And that's how we saw that growth happen, really, was just kind of seeing the EV growth and like how businesses can benefit from having it.
Yeah, and I know we have a national and international audience, so everyone knows that Texas is the home of oil and gas and the leader in oil and gas nationally. But they may not know that Texas actually beats out California, sorry, Michael, in terms of clean energy and in terms of both wind and solar. So they've got a big interest too in the use of electricity as a fuel. So one of the big things that came out of our roundtable where we brought together these 8 cities was how important partnerships were for a city charging program. Both partnerships external to government and partnerships within government. So I would love to hear about your initial partners and what your partnership model was or is. So Sara, why don't you start us on that?
Yeah, so we have different partnership models based on AC charging and on DC charging. So the curbside AC chargers, we own them and we operate them as a city. And then we have a partnership with the electrical entrepreneur company who does like the installation and the service. And the reason why we've done this is because we want to have control of the public streets. So we want to avoid sort of privatizing public streets. And we also have an operations team in-house that does sort of the day-to-day operations, and then the bigger service tasks is outsourced. And in the DC charging, we have many different partners. We started off with one fast charging company, and in the recent year, we have included more and more. So now we have partnerships with 5 different fast charging companies, and we've done this to make sure that it's a competition between them. So they have to, like, getting a agreement with the city is a big thing for them. And we also, in that terms, do partnerships where they have to compete on how much revenue they're willing to share with the city. So in this partnership, it's like a sharing of risk, but it's also a sharing of revenue. In addition to that, we have smaller pilots that's more short term, where we have partnerships where we get to test out, for example, new charging equipment. So currently we have a pilot with a company that does like mobile fast charging containers, which is something we've been wanting to try out just to see if that's something we can, for example, use in locations where we don't have access for that many years. For example, if there's a plan to build housing there, but not until like 3 or 5 years, then we want to see if we can have like mobile charging station that doesn't demand that much cost and investment in the electrical work. So that's different ways to use partnerships depending on.
So I think you made 3 really important points. One is create a competitive market to get good service. 2 is design your contracts with private partners to align interests of the city and its private partners. And 3, experiment and innovate with new technologies. Michael, when you came to Cambridge, you came with different parts of city government. So talk to the audience about partnerships and how they're part of LA's charging program.
Well, I would agree, with everything Sara said. Different partners for different types of things you're doing. Like you mentioned, we have also a municipal utility in Los Angeles, so they are obviously sort of number one partner in all of this work. And then our Bureau of Street Lighting, which is the department which oversees just our street lights, installs EV chargers on the curbside. We've got around 600 of them right now, although they've actually installed more over the years, but with vandalism and other issues, we have a little bit less right now. But those are examples of internal partners and internal stakeholders, and there's so many more. For our fleet, we've got those folks that we're working with, and if you don't have champions who sort of are your best partners within, this is on the internal side with our fleets, you're not going to get anywhere. I remember the first big project we did was a similar 100 chargers. We thought it was insane, and how are we going to get this done? And it was actually with our police department. And the reason we were able to accomplish that project was because the head of the police fleet put his hand up and said, we'll do it. We'll go big. 100 chargers, 100 vehicles. We're going to make this thing happen, which was tremendous. That sort of put the wind behind our sails and really moved things forward. So internally, you have to have those champions, or we'll call them your partners. You want to all be rowing in the same direction. And, as we move to a more market-focused approach, then yes, of course, you need to be listening, getting feedback. We're not perfect. We are bureaucratic. There's a lot that we can do better internally and sort of make things faster. And so when we get constructive feedback and not just complaints, because sometimes it comes in the form of just complaints, but when there's actual constructive feedback, we want to implement modifications to whether it's our permitting processes or the utility timelines or utility work. We want to learn, we want to improve. So those are partnerships where if there's trust with those, whoever the EVSP happens to be, then we can take that feedback and implement changes that improve the system for everyone. So the sort of positive feedback loop through good partnerships really can have a ultimately beneficial effect on our deployments of chargers.
So that's really interesting because you're talking about, it's part of your role, the city leading by example with adopting EVs. But for the audience, how many people would think police would be an early adoption of EVs? Yeah. EVs are actually fantastic police pursuit vehicles, right? Police pursuit vehicles generally have really big engines, so they can go really fast to, chase bad guys like in the movies. But they don't do a lot of range. So EVs are fantastic. They're super fast accelerating. And most police departments only do like 100 miles per day on their vehicles. So really interesting. So Great. So another thing that really came through in all the conversations we had was the importance of cities looking through their policies and identifying policy changes that would either be enabling or take away obstacles to installing chargers. And so let's start with Cameron. Can you highlight an important policy change that the city of Austin made that was enabling for chargers?
Absolutely. I'll kind of hit it from two ways. One, on the proactive policy side, we have what we developed, I think it went live in 2021, was our Austin's Climate Equity Plan. And that was really around our pathway to net zero, as a community, over the next 20 years or so. So, and then within that, we highlighted things like transportation electrification, very large goals. Like we want 40% of all of our vehicle miles traveled to be electric by then. So that just sends a signal to a lot of the industry, around the city's support for doing this. So that's kind of one of the ways you can proactively show that support. Companies look at these things. They look at like where they'll be supported by local or state or whatever that government is. But also, there's a lot of things that when you start deploying like EV charging, that you have to be reactive with your policy as well. And I'll give an example of that. One is, I'm with our municipal utility, which means the city owns the electric company. We're a city department. We're not a private business. But we have a policy in the city that's basically said nobody else can resell electricity besides the municipal utility. That was written a long time before electric vehicles existed or EV charging existed, or people were trying to monetize EV charging as a business model. So we actually had to retroactively go back, kind of carve out an exclusion saying that, yes, no one else can resell electricity or sell it unless it's for transportation electrification uses. So it's just small things like that that can be huge barriers, for like charging companies coming in, because without doing that, you basically have the option of, if you're an EV charging company or if you want to run that as a business, either go right outside of where we do our service territory, so you'll be outside of the city, or you have to give it away for free. And not a very attractive option for a lot of companies. So we don't want to be in competition with them. We want to welcome that stuff in. So you're going to come across those over and over and over again in terms of like what policies may slow this stuff down, like I mentioned, permitting. So that's a whole another area too.
Michael, any policy changes that have been critical in Los Angeles?
Well, first of all, I'm having a little PTSD from what Cameron just described about the municipal utilities and resale of electricity. We went through that as well. In fact, I've got an issue with that right now. We've implemented so many small changes, right, or building code updates, and all of those are important. Everything adds up over the course of, the goal of installing more chargers more rapidly. But I have an example that I always like to use. This is more on the vehicle side, but it's how local policy can potentially, and this is California specific to some extent, but how local policy can affect broader changes. So in 2017, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach adopted an updated Clean Air Action Plan. In that action plan, it required that all trucks servicing the ports had to be had to be zero emission. Technology agnostic, but had to be zero emission by 2035. And that ultimately essentially made it into the governor's executive order a few years later after some other wildfires that happened in California. And that is what led to the California Air Resources Board Advanced Clean Trucks and Advanced Clean Fleets rule, which set those rules for California. And yes, they are being challenged right now, and we just withdrew a waiver for advanced clean fleets, but you get the idea. And we have all the other ZEV states within the country who follow California's vehicle policies. So that, for me, is this incredible example of how something echoes and gets bigger, when you set local policy with ambitious goals.
Right. And you pointed to something really big in the environment. The Trump administration is, from the very first day in the Unleashing American Energy Executive Order, has been looking to reduce federal support for both EV purchases and for charging through asking states to stop spending the NEVI or highway funds from the bipartisan infrastructure law. So it's a changing environment. in a changing environment in terms of federal support, which has been important for many American cities in terms of building out their charging networks. But so I think it's really important to talk about funding and different models. So each city has done something different, but let's start with you, Sara. How do you choose when the city invests itself versus when turning to private partners? And that's probably evolved as the city's market has changed, so maybe there's a before and after sort of answer here.
Yeah, so we build curbside chargers in areas where people are dependent on street parking, which means that we don't build the same amount of chargers in each city district. In some city districts, we basically don't build any chargers at all. And the reason for that is that it's mostly detached housing, so people have their own garages or their own driveways, so they can install a charger on their own, much cheaper and way more practical than to charge on the street. So we focus on the 30% of the population in Oslo that don't have access to a private parking spot or a private parking garage. So that's our target group, which means that we build way more chargers in the inner city and in the city areas which have old buildings. So basically housing built before the 1930s or 40s. So that's the areas where we focus on. We also have a support scheme that's where housing associations, for example, can apply to cover the cost of upgrading the electrical grids in the parking garages. And through that support scheme, we have facilitated about 60,000 charging points on private ground, and that's actually way cheaper for us than to build the curbside chargers. So we try to only invest in the curbside chargers in the particular areas where they're needed, just to not over-invest, because we don't want to build chargers that nobody uses. And when it comes to fast charging, like I said, we have a different model where we split the investments. So the city takes the investment cost of everything underground, basically. So all the cabling and connecting to the electrical grid. And then the fast charging company owns the charger themselves, so they own and operate all the hardware. And then we split some of the revenue. So through that model, we've actually earned our money back, basically, in the investment. So the return of investment in many of our fast charging stations is around like 3 years in some places, depending on how centrally located they are. So through sort of the different investment models, we made it profitable in different ways. So our philosophy is basically that the public space that we use is valuable, so the city should get something back for making it as accessible to private companies to also make money. So we see it as a win-win for both of us.
It's essentially a lease payment source for the access to the curbside or other public land. So, Michael, what about Los Angeles? What's been important in terms of funding models? When does the city invest? When is it pure private?
So I think we're similar, not identical, but similar to what's been going on in Oslo. And really we've seen the need for the city to be a direct installer or direct owner of sort of publicly available charging has decreased. We don't, frankly, we're not the best at owning and operating equipment. You know, it's the private sector does a pretty good job of that because you have good business rationale to keep your equipment up and running. So we have moved away from, applying for grants with the California Energy Commission or whoever it happens to be so that we can install, 5, 10, 20 chargers in a public lot. And really, aside from our curbside chargers, which we do continue to install, and we do see our role, we own the street lights, we're the only ones who can touch them, we're the only ones who can install a charger on them. So those make sense for us to invest directly in, and they do generate revenue, so that's good. But beyond that, we own parking lots, we own facilities, and we are now really looking to sort of make those more available to companies who might want to come in and install chargers. That's one way. And then sort of the biggest investment from our end is through the utility. We have a lot of incentive and rebate money. Since 2018, we've given out over $165 million to help support the installation of EV charging. So that's really, in terms of our funds and our available money, what we're doing. And I'll just note, because it's, I think, somewhat of interest, we are using low carbon fuel standard credits to fund that work. It is not rate funding. So that is because we have a cap and trade carbon market in California, we're able to take those LCFS credits and use those proceeds to fund this work, which has a sort of self-perpetuating scenario, because the more we make, the more we install, the more we install, the more we make. So that's been an ongoing good source of funding.
Great. So basically, both places have sort of been able to get to places where the chargers either directly or indirectly pay for themselves in reasonable time frames.
Yeah.
So it's really, now, a really important question, you need to not only install chargers, they need to keep working so people can use them. And if they aren't working in large numbers, it can be a deterrent to adoption more than an attraction. So let's talk about operations and maintenance. So let's stay with you, Michael. How does LA handle operations and maintenance? Did you have a budget at the beginning for O&M? Were costs higher or lower than you anticipated? And what's your advice on how cities should think about operations and maintenance?
Should be one of your top thoughts. That's my number one advice. Definitely put money away for that. You will have O&M costs. For a lot of our initial installs, we were purchasing 5-year maintenance agreements with that. So that was the software, the networking, the maintenance. And it turns out that, at least for a lot of our public chargers, the sort of day-to-day maintenance was less important. We were suffering a lot of vandalism, which tended to not be covered through those contracts. So that requires having money set aside for all of that work. This is definitely turning out to be, when we were discussing earlier just amongst ourselves, when you install a non-networked, dumb charger, you tend to it just works. It's great. You plug it into a car and it just works. Once you add the additional element of smarts to the charger, data network enabled, somehow your O&M needs just, go through the roof. There's always something going on, with the software, with data outages or whatever it happens to be. So yes, you need to prepare. You need to have money set aside for it. It's not an insignificant part of your issues. I will also say, if you are working with a sort of a turnkey solution, you may want their technicians to be in-house. We have found that when it's a sort of a sub, sometimes that leads to problems. Business models are different everywhere, but having the technicians be a part of the company that is providing you your service, we have found that to be helpful for us. But I'm sure we've seen other things.
Yeah, so I want to hit a couple other questions before we start turning to audience questions. But I also want to say that data is really helpful for the EV owner. It's helpful to be able to look up what charger should I take my vehicle to charge now. What's working and available. Otherwise, you can be running around looking for chargers, and that can cause frustration. But we focused our conversation mostly on passenger vehicles and small light-duty vehicles today. But are any of your cities focused on building charging infrastructure for other transportation elements like freight? Michael, you've already pointed that a little bit. Sara, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, so we have been focusing in the last few years on building fast chargers for heavy-duty vehicles, because we see that in that segment is a really big part of the emissions for transport. So that's where we can, if we manage to get switched out fossil heavy-duty vehicles to electric vehicles, we can lower the emissions quite quickly. So we recently opened the charging hub with 10 fast chargers for heavy-duty vehicles in a cooperation with the harbor of Oslo. So this charging station is located very close to where the cruise ships come, because the harbor has a goal of zero emission buses driving the cruise tourists to the city, and we had a goal of building fast chargers for like bigger trucks. So then we cooperated and did it together, so we could like get both of our goals and funded it together. So that's been a really good focus on especially in the freight segment. Is often, I mean, it's very big and it's quite different charging needs. So to cooperate both with internal partners, but also with the companies that does freight and goods delivery themselves, you can get some good results.
So I want to ask one more question to all three cities, and then we're going to turn to your questions in the audience. So if you have a question, looks like we've only got one mic, and it's over on that side. But if you have a question, feel free to make your way to the mic. But before we take the audience questions, I want each of you to tell me what's your top advice that you want to share as something that's must do based on your city's program. So like imagine you're talking to a city that's just launching their program. What's the number one thing you most want them to know? You want to start, Cameron?
Sure. I'm going to mess up and I'm going to give two. One, I'm doubling down on what Michael mentioned with O&M. Things will break. Our success metric was way back when was once we get these installed, our job is done. We've done wonderful. We can pat ourselves on the back and just grow. That was great until it wasn't. And so just understanding that there is a lot of O&M that goes into this, whether it be maintenance or financial transactions, all of that. The other side, I would say, is really also emphasizing the partnership piece again, but not just industry partners, not just vendors. Good ideas need friends, especially new ideas. And so understanding, how to leverage those relationships in a good way to get mutual goals. For instance, I'm at the electric utility. We have nothing to do with the streets, but we have to work with like our transportation departments to get, right of way, to utilize infrastructure to, put charging in marquee places. We have to work with our permitting departments. We have to work with private businesses to highlight these things. So you don't know what the end product's going to look like, and you're going to be reliant on whether it be public sector or private sector partners to make this stuff successful. So they can also help you kind of in the dreaming aspect of it. And that gets a lot easier to implement if they're involved in it as part of that too.
Okay, so maintenance, and it takes a team inside and outside of the city to get things done. Sara?
My advice would be to not sort of get lost in the planning process, because the e-mobility is developing so fast that if you spend too many years on planning, the plan will be outdated before you even start. So I think it's important to set a vision, and it could very well be an ambitious vision. Set some goals, for example, the number of chargers you want to install, but also some quality goals. For example, what occupational rates you want, or who the target group is, or what the pricing should be, and then start. The best way to learn is by doing, making some mistakes, and then adapt as you go along with the lessons, and then some
Just
action.
do it. Be flexible. Michael?
I love what Sara just said, and I love what Cameron said as well. Just start. I have worked, and spoken with a lot of other cities, and a lot of times they need to have a strategic plan. It needs to be voted on by their city council or whatever, all these kind of things, and none of that gets, chargers in the ground. And you need to get chargers in the ground. You just have to start, and you can be working on a strat plan while you're also, testing things out. So I fully agree with that. Projects are going to take longer than you think, and they're going to cost more than you think. Nothing revolutionary there, but that would be, sort of my, just know that it's going to take longer, so start now, and probably, especially with new tariffs and things like that, going to cost you a lot more than you thought. So put some money away and get started.
We touched on, but we've got a line of questions, so let's hear it.
Thank you very much. My name is Michelle Grimm. I'm a state representative in Ohio, and I'm going to address this to there's two warm climates on the stage, but I'm going to address this to the colder climate on the stage because in Ohio we get cold. So my Republican colleagues like to point to this viral video from last year where I think it was in Chicago Midway, where everybody was frozen out of their EV chargers, but fail to neglect that internal combustion engines also don't start in negative 30 because they also have batteries, right? So I guess my question is, Norway is cold. I think you have the most EVs in the world right now. What would you say to the colleagues? Well, it's too cold. The chargers are going to freeze up. The cars don't go as long. What would you say to that? Since you're doing it in Norway, and what would your advice be?
I think it's not that big of an issue actually. It works very well in the cold. It's true, you have to charge more often, and people might be more dependent on fast charging, but it's not that cold in Oslo either, and now the EV rates are really going up in the north of Norway, close to the border of Finland and Russia, and if they can do it, then I think Ohio can do it as well.
I would agree.
Thank you, great answer.
Mine's more of a land use question in terms of the electric vehicle charging. Obviously, car storage in cities is not the best land use, although in the United States is obviously a reality that's not going to necessarily change anytime soon. The other political reality is right now, it feels like private industry is going to really need to play a much larger role in this. Obviously, the curbside charging, which sounds like the best kind of land use case of this, is really important, but there's limited areas in our cities where that is going to make all of the sense. And it's great that it is happening in the US, but it's not going to be the main thing. Here in Austin, there's a few proposed private charging stations. Think of it like a gas station, but for electric vehicles. One of them is being proposed on a pretty major transit corridor. It's the largest bus route in the city, kind of there, and it feels like not the best use of the space considering it'll be on that route. It's also going to be on a light rail route for folks in Austin, North Loop area, and Lamar. What sort of thoughts do you all have on how to make sure that we're providing this electric vehicle charging while also doing it in the right places as far as solving the larger transportation issues in general that we're all dealing with in cities?
I have thoughts on this. So I'm in Los Angeles, and I can't compare with the density of Austin. I'm not sure how that looks here, but certainly this is a big question. We're actually in the middle of a new zoning ordinance to update and make clearer the land use rules, right? So it's not to allow charging everywhere, but to make it very clear for potential developers where and where not, what makes sense. I think, we have very ambitious density goals in Los Angeles, and definitely, surface parking lots are not the best use, I think we would all agree, of land. So we generally, as a primary use, would allow for charging in an existing lot, right? That can be an accessory use or a primary use. And, that we're defining that right now. We have some multifamily neighborhoods where you may have a surface lot, and there may be some updated zoning if it's a transportation-oriented, district. Do we want to allow that to continue to be a surface lot? This is a tough question because we need the chargers, and you need space to put the chargers in. So I think, we're trying to be, you need to have some amount of gray in there. There needs to be some flexibility to allow, maybe you have to keep an amenity or put a new amenity on that surface lot, a little coffee shop, a little parklet, whatever it happens to be, that makes that still a sort of up-zoned use of that lot if you're going to allow for something like this. It's a little bit different when you look at medium and heavy duty use cases, for freight or goods movement and things of that that case, they tend to be in more industrial zones where maybe you're less concerned about that. So I guess I would say keep an eye on our zoning code, where we are trying to figure it out. We're going to go through a whole, sorry to use lingo here, a whole CEQA process around this and get feedback from everybody, and really try to hone in on where it makes sense. But it's not one size fits all.
I'm also living that alongside you here in Austin in terms of seeing that growth. And, for years, we've just been hoping that investment would come. And now that it's here, it's like, oh no, that investment has come. Because things that we've wanted, like, mass amounts of EV charging, especially funded by the private sector, are now competing with things like, the Imagine Austin plan, if you're like, walkable corridors, enticing other businesses. This is less of an answer, but more of a understanding of, I think that's how that's going to eventually clear up, is be clear of the expectations of where those can and should be built early. Because one thing that we've come across by not having that in place, these companies are they're going through very rigorous processes for land acquisition, land leases, identifying where power is available, identifying, zoning, all of this. And so they go through a lot of work to identify these. We think it's a good idea as a city overall, but then there's conflict at either the neighborhood level, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm anxious to see what the outcome. Austin did some, kind of zoning law or zoning ordinance stuff recently around it, but I still think we're to be determined. So.
I appreciate y'all's thoughts. I know there's not a real answer necessarily, but I appreciate y'all's thoughts on it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question around culture and technology adoption. In Oslo.
Can you speak a little louder?
Oh, sorry. I had a question around culture. In Oslo, how much of the success around EV adoption comes from Norwegian culture versus the state of the technology and the state of the EV market?
So I'm just going to repeat the question. How much is cultural versus technological in Oslo?
Yep.
Well, that's a very good question. I'm not sure if I have a very good answer to it. I think it's a little bit of both. Sure, the culture of car ownership in Norway is probably quite different than the US, and people might not be that loyal to specific brands or specific types of cars, so might be more open to trying different brands and brands from lots of different countries. So not necessarily be as loyal, maybe that's the right word. I think part of the success has been that we've had sort of the national governments and the local governments have usually agreed on that this is an important goal, and we'll keep the stability of the policies. So I think that's, of course, a luxury, and probably also a cultural thing in Norwegian politics, that it's maybe more of a cooperation than other places. So yeah, that's just finding the solutions together, and then they often agree on the goal and the principle, and then there's a lot of disagreements on the specific of different policies. But yeah, so definitely a little bit of both, I would say.
That makes sense, thanks.
So somewhat of a follow-up to the previous question. When it comes to market adoption, I think each of you are kind of talking about early adopters, people who kind of, for virtue reasons or for whatever their own motivations are, they choose to adopt EV because they think it's a good idea. When it comes to expanding to a larger market, I'd really be interested in hearing from each of the panelists what your strategies are for changing hearts and minds about EV in relation to their existing modes of transportation.
It's a great one.
Yeah.
You wanna start, Cameron?
I can start on our side, and at least from the Texas model, because you have people that are enthusiasts, and you have just as many antagonists. So as this market grows, so the environmental side, that's in full swing. So people that have that kind of motivation, a lot of what motivates, where I've seen a lot of motivation factors here is, one, having something similar to what you already have and having an electric equivalent of that. I know like in the kind of early adopter model is wanting something completely different, new stands out, and that still exists. But basically the idea that you're not transitioning to something new, that this is maybe a more familiar transition, like that's something that's gonna drive it. So seeing in Texas, the electric F-150, the electric Silverado, the stuff that Ram is doing, so seeing like that market availability is gonna be a huge part of it, not just for individual drivers, but also for fleets, because they can make that comparison extremely easy. And the best way of changing the hearts and mind that I found out is literally getting somebody in the seat, especially new users, getting them behind the wheel of it, understanding that this is something that is just a better experience. It's not an environmental play. It's there's the financial side of it. There's just the overall ease of use, the fact that you can charge at home, all of those simple things. But that vehicle availability is going to be a huge part that drives out from the early adopters into mass market. Also, nothing secretive here, but price points coming down. That's going to make a huge piece of it as well. So it's going from kind of a niche thing, years ago, into, this is just any other vehicle. Like it's nothing extreme anymore. It's just kind of a safe option. I'm not going out on a limb to adopt it.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, I think sort of making people aware of like how to charge, and because I think that's a big barrier for a lot of people. They worry that it's going to be difficult, you won't be able to understand it, you will be confused by the app or the RFID chip, or the battery will run out when you're in the middle of the highway, etc. So I think people who haven't used EVs and chargers before might be quite worried about those things. So to just give people knowledge on how to do it and to make them realize that it's not that difficult as they might fear. And in Norway, we had a very active EV association that's done a lot of good work on like teaching people how to charge and teaching people how to use the apps, how to use the different chargers, and also being very heavily promoting that fast charging companies and all charging companies should have good and clear information on the chargers of how to use them, and just make it really like step by step. This is how you do it. It's not that difficult.
So EV education. So I think I want to turn to our next questioner, just because we're getting down to it. We could probably get in one more question, or I have one I'd love to ask.
Yes, thank you for the presentation and sharing your insights. I know a key driver, pun intended, in Norway is for the adoption of EV is the incentives that it brought by eliminating tolls and ferry costs and these types of things. So I'm just curious, in LA and in Austin, are there ways to explore incentives that'll drive people to switch to EVs, by free, city parking, or just have y'all explored any of these kind of opportunities, or could you brainstorm any right now that you think might be good?
Very quickly, yeah, so in LA, we're already doing that. We have a used EV rebate through our utility, so I think you can get up to, I'm gonna probably get it wrong, I want to say $4,000 now, or $4,500 through the utility. That's, if you're in a disadvantaged community, it's a little bit less if you're just a normal resident. And so that's one, and that's an area we definitely want to focus on, because getting people that, that market, the used market, sort of moving forward is really important. We have other incentives we've looked at. I can tell you, I had vigorous debates with my colleagues in the transportation group in the mayor's office around, hey, can we give free parking? And they said, no, Donald Shoup, no free parking, and those kind of things for the people who are into parking nerd stuff. So we don't do that, but we do, for example, have zero-emission loading zones, just 11 of them right now, but we have a plan to build out about 30 more in our downtown area. That's for commercial, your UPS, FedEx, Amazon type delivery, and right now those are an incentive. We haven't taken away an existing curb, although eventually that's where it will go, but right now it's, hey, if you have a zero-emission delivery truck, you have priority. You know, we've got places where only you can go. So that's another way we're looking at a sort of indirect incentive to help move people in that direction. You know, California generally has had a lot of money going towards these kind of things through the state, so we've looked at that broadly. But you know, with respect to parking and things like that, it's hard to, those are touchy subjects, so we're a little bit careful with that.
Great. Let's do one more question, short answer.
So in '76, my grandfather bought a Volkswagen Passat, and it still runs today. And if I buy an EV today, maybe in 10 years, the system will start to fail, and in 15 years, it will probably go to the garbage. So I don't think it's connected with the sense of cleaning and sustainability. So how do you think the industry can manage it? And how real do you think is planning of obsolescence real in the industry?
So let me see if I understand the question. Cars live for a long time. Average car in the US is 14 years old now. How do we transition the fleet? Is that the question?
No, like I think old cars, they were more durable. So the example that I gave, it's a Passat that still runs today, and it's from 1976. But today's cars, they have a short lifetime. So do you agree with that?
Actually, in the US, like vehicles have never been older. So in the US, they've actually gotten to having longer life. You may have an exceptional Passat, but are EVs going to be durable as old cars? Is that how we should take that on? As old?
Yeah, I'm asking about the batteries and all the components that are hard to fix.
Right. So I guess I'm going to take this on as the former automaker person. And so battery life has improved substantially. So battery technology is changing by leaps and bounds. There's just an enormous amount of research and investment in it. Two, so batteries they're also proving to be substantially longer lived than expected. One of the things they're discovering is a lot of the testing of how long batteries would live was done in terms of running them continuously, because you're trying to get a quick answer in real time. And they find that the way people actually use them, which is they drive them, then they let the battery rest, and they drive them and they let the battery rest, is proving that battery life is a lot longer. Some of the experiments that are being done, like the testing phases, are showing batteries lasting 1 million miles. So I think that this is something that is evolving very rapidly, even for the batteries that are now in market, and it's improving. So I think it's time for us to wrap. This has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank Sara and Michael for flying in, Sara all the way from Norway for this conversation, and Cameron for hosting us, and all of you for getting up early and being such an engaged and clearly knowledgeable audience from the conversations. And we're all happy to stick around out in the hallway if you want to ask some more questions. Thank you for joining us.